Imagine a young professional in their late 20s, someone who has done everything correctly by the standards of modern career advice, earned a degree, secured a stable job, and worked their way up to a respectable salary of $70,000 per year. They live in a modest apartment, drive a reliable used car, and have enough left over each month to save a little while also enjoying occasional dinners out with friends. Now imagine that same person 5 years later, now earning $90,000 per year, a $20,000 raise that should, by any logical measure, leave them feeling significantly more comfortable and financially secure. Yet, when you ask them how they feel, they describe the same sense of pressure, the same tightness at the end of each month, and a strange new anxiety about expenses that never existed before. Their apartment is nicer, but not twice as nice. Their car is newer, but not dramatically so. Their social life involves different restaurants and perhaps a gym membership, but nothing that looks like obvious luxury. What happened to the $20,000, and why does a significant raise feel like no raise at all? The answer lies in a hidden economic force that operates on almost every person who moves upward through the income distribution, a force that explains why keeping up with the perceived standards of your social group becomes exponentially harder as you earn more. This is the status expense curve, and understanding its shape is essential for anyone who wants to escape the treadmill of invisible lifestyle inflation and actually feel the benefits of their own hard work. The core concept of the status expense curve is borrowed from social comparison theory and from the work of economists and sociologists who have studied how humans evaluate their own well-being relative to others. The basic insight is that the cost of maintaining a given level of social status does not increase linearly with income, but instead accelerates, meaning that each additional rung on the economic ladder requires a larger and larger expenditure, simply to avoid falling behind in the eyes of your peers. At low income levels, status markers are relatively cheap. A clean shirt, a reliable bus pass, the ability to buy a round of drinks once a month. But as you move into the middle class, the markers become more expensive. A car that is not too old, a neighborhood that is not too dangerous, clothing that signals professionalism. And as you move into upper middle and higher income brackets, the expenses explode. Private school tuition, country club memberships, home renovations, luxury cars that depreciate faster than economy cars, vacations that must be Instagram-worthy, and 1,000 other costs that are not technically necessities, but become necessities for maintaining your standing within your social world. The cruel math of the status expense curve is that the gap between what you earn and what you need to spend to feel adequate widens as you earn more, so that a person earning $50,000 might feel perfectly fine spending $30,000, while a person earning $150,000 might feel stressed. Spending $120,000 because their reference group now includes people earning $200,000. The curve is not about absolute poverty. It is about relative position. And relative position is a moving target that gets more expensive to hit the closer you get to the top. The psychological explanation for the status expense curve lies in how human brains process social standing, a mechanism that evolved in small tribal groups where status was closely tied to survival and reproductive success. Neuroscientists have shown that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain, and that perceived inferiority in status triggers genuine distress. In the ancestral environment, being low status meant less access to food, mates, and protection, so the brain developed powerful motivational systems to avoid that outcome. The problem is that those systems did not evolve to handle modern, large-scale, highly stratified societies where reference groups are not fixed, but are constantly shifting upward as you improve your own situation. When you get a raise, you do not simply have more money, you also tend to shift your social circle, even unconsciously, toward people who earn similar or higher amounts. You start comparing yourself to colleagues at your new level, neighbors in the slightly nicer neighborhood you moved to, or friends from professional networks who are on similar trajectories. Each time your income rises, your reference group resets, and the bar for what counts as acceptable status rises with it. This is known as the hedonic treadmill applied to social comparison, and it explains why winning the lottery often fails to produce lasting happiness, because the winner's reference group quickly shifts to other wealthy people, and the same anxious comparisons resume at a higher spending level. The status expense curve is the financial manifestation of this psychological quirk, and it means that the harder you work to climb, the more expensive it becomes just to stand still in your own mind. Let us bring the math into this discussion with a concrete illustration of how the status expense curve operates across different income brackets. Consider 3 reference groups, each defined by a typical annual expenditure on visible status markers such as housing, transportation, clothing, dining, and leisure. For a group earning $40,000 to $60,000, the modal status expenditure might be around $15,000 per year, covering a modest apartment, a 10-year-old car, basic clothing brands, and occasional restaurant meals. For a group earning $80,000 to $120,000, the status expenditure might be $40,000 per year, including a nicer rental or starter home, a 3 to 5-year-old car, mid-tier brands, and weekly dining out. For a group earning $150,000 to $250,000, the status expenditure might be $100,000 per year, including a mortgage on a substantial house, a new luxury car or 2, designer clothing, frequent fine dining, and annual vacations. Notice that as income doubles from $60,000 to $120,000, status expenditure more than doubles, from $15,000 to $40,000. As income roughly doubles again to $250,000, status expenditure more than doubles again, from $40,000 to $100,000. The proportion of income consumed by status spending actually increases with income, from roughly 30% at the lower level to 33% at the middle level to 40% at the upper level. This means that a person earning $250,000 may have less discretionary income relative to their perceived needs than a person earning $60,000, because the baseline for acceptable status is so much higher. The person at the top is spending $100,000 just to keep up, leaving $150,000 for taxes, savings, and everything else, while the person at the bottom spends $15,000 to keep up, leaving $45,000. But because the top earner's social world is filled with people spending $150,000 on status, they feel pinched, while the bottom earner's social world is filled with people spending $15,000, so they feel fine. The math of relative spending is deeply unintuitive, and it is the engine of the status expense curve. We need to zoom out now and look at the systemic mechanics that amplify this curve beyond individual psychology. Modern capitalism, especially the marketing and advertising industries, has perfected the art of creating and exploiting status anxiety. Luxury brands do not simply sell products, they sell membership in an exclusive tier, and they carefully manage pricing to ensure that their goods are expensive enough to signal status, but not so expensive that the target market cannot stretch to afford them. The automobile industry has long understood that the difference between a mid-range and a luxury car is often far less than the price difference suggests. But the luxury badge commands a premium precisely because of its status signaling value. The housing market operates on similar dynamics, with neighborhoods priced not just on square footage and location, but on the perceived status of the address. a premium that can add hundreds of thousands of dollars for no tangible benefit other than the ability to say you live there. Social media has supercharged the status expense curve by making everyone's consumption visible to a much wider audience, creating constant opportunities for comparison and envy. A generation ago, you only knew what your neighbors and close friends owned. Today, you see the curated highlight reels of thousands of people, many of whom are spending beyond their means to project an image of success, which in turn raises the perceived bar for everyone who watches them. The system is not conspiring against you, but it is structurally optimized to keep you spending, because status anxiety is one of the most reliable drivers of economic activity. Every time you feel that your car is too old, your kitchen is outdated, or your vacation photos look modest compared to a friend's, you are experiencing a designed feature of the consumer economy, not a genuine deficiency in your life. History offers clear parallels that help us understand why the status expense curve has become steeper over time. In pre-industrial societies, status was largely inherited and fixed, with sumptuary laws in many cultures actually restricting what non-nobles could wear or own, making status markers legally enforced rather than competitively acquired. The rise of industrial capitalism and mass production made status goods available to a much wider population. But it also democratized status competition because anyone who could earn enough money could now buy the markers of a higher class. The 20th century saw the emergence of what sociologist Thorstein Veblen called conspicuous consumption, the practice of spending money on luxury goods specifically to demonstrate wealth, and Veblen observed that this spending followed a pattern of invidious comparison where each person's consumption was driven by the desire to not fall behind their immediate social superiors. In the post-war era, the expansion of consumer credit made it possible to engage in status spending without actually having the income to support it, which flattened the relationship between income and visible consumption, making it harder to tell who was genuinely wealthy and who was simply leveraged. This credit-fueled status spending has made the status expense curve even more punishing, because the reference group now includes people who appear to be spending at a certain level but are actually borrowing to do so, raising the bar for everyone else. A person who refuses to take on debt for status markers may feel inadequate compared to peers who appear to have nicer homes and cars, not realizing that those peers are financially fragile. The historical trend is clear. As credit has expanded and social visibility has increased, the cost of maintaining a given relative position has risen faster than incomes, making the status expense curve steeper with each passing decade. The identity shift required to escape the status expense curve is one of the most difficult but most liberating changes a person can make, because it requires decoupling self-worth from visible consumption. The default identity in modern consumer culture is that of the aspirational comparer, someone who looks upward, notes what the people above them have, and strives to acquire those same markers. This identity is reinforced by advertising, social media, and even casual conversation, where discussions of new purchases, home renovations, and vacation plans are constant reminders of the status ladder. The alternative identity is that of the intentional decoupler, someone who recognizes that the status expense curve is a trap and chooses to opt out of the competition. This does not mean living like a monk or rejecting all forms of comfort and beauty. It means making a conscious decision about which status markers genuinely improve your life and which are simply expensive answers to questions no one asked. The decoupler asks, if no one else ever saw this purchase, would I still want it? If the answer is no, then the purchase is purely about status, and the decoupler either rejects it or accepts it only with full awareness that they are paying for social signaling rather than genuine utility. This shift is hard because humans are deeply social animals, and the approval of our peers feels genuinely important. But the decoupler realizes that the peers who matter most are those who accept them regardless of their possessions, and that chasing the approval of the wider status game is a losing battle because the goalposts will always move. The identity shift is from competing on the status curve to defining your own metrics of a good life. And that shift, while uncomfortable at first, is the only reliable way to flatten the curve for yourself. Let us examine practical strategies for flattening your personal status expense curve without becoming socially isolated or feeling deprived. The first strategy is to deliberately choose a reference group that is not based solely on income, such as a hobby community, a religious or spiritual group, a volunteer organization, or a family network where status markers are less emphasized. When your primary social world values skills, kindness, humor, or shared experiences rather than possessions, the pressure to spend on status drops dramatically. The second strategy is to become what researchers call a satisficer rather than a maximizer in consumption, meaning you set a reasonable threshold for quality and then stop searching, rather than always looking for the best possible option. A satisficer buys a perfectly good car for $30,000 and drives it for 10 years, while a maximizer feels compelled to spend $50,000 on the car that offers slightly better status signaling, even though the functional difference is minimal. The third strategy is to practice what the writer and financial independence advocate, Mr. Money Mustache, called the shockingly simple math of swapping expensive status markers for cheaper ones that still meet your needs, such as buying a used luxury car for the same price as a new economy car, or renting an apartment in a desirable neighborhood rather than buying a house there, or wearing well-made but unbranded clothing instead of designer labels. The fourth strategy is to pre-commit to saving a large portion of every raise before you ever see it in your checking account, so that the money is automatically diverted to investments and never becomes available for status spending. This is the opposite of the typical pattern, where people allow lifestyle to expand to consume new income, and it is one of the most effective ways to avoid climbing the status expense curve unintentionally. Each of these strategies requires ongoing attention because the pressure to spend on status never disappears, but over time they become habits, and the freedom that comes from no longer running the race is its own reward. The calm closing to this exploration is an invitation to step off the treadmill and look at the status expense curve from a distance, seeing it for what it is, a social and psychological pattern, not a law of nature. The curve is real, and it is powerful, but it is also optional. You can choose to participate in the status competition, spending more and more as you earn more, always feeling like you are barely keeping up, or you can choose to step aside and define your own standards. The people who appear to be ahead of you on the curve are often not happier, not more secure, and not wealthier in any real sense. They are simply deeper into the trap. The true measure of financial success is not how much you spend on visible markers, but how much freedom you have. Freedom from the anxiety of keeping up, freedom to take risks, freedom to say no to work you dislike, and freedom to spend your time and attention on things that genuinely matter to you. Those freedoms are not purchased with status goods. They are purchased with savings, investments, and a deliberate refusal to let the status expense curve dictate your choices. So the next time you feel the urge to spend money just to keep up, pause and ask yourself who you are keeping up with and whether they are even aware of the race you are running. The odds are good that they are too busy running their own race to notice yours, and that realization, once truly internalized, is the beginning of a quieter, richer, and far less expensive way to live.